In December 1941, deep in the Libyan desert, a tiny Australian force of just 400 men confronted an Italian garrison more than 6 times their size. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was one of the most shocking collapses of the North African campaign. A night assault so fast, so precise, and so unexpected that the Italians didn't realize they were defeated until it was already over. This is the unbelievable story of how 400 Australians shattered 2,500 Italian troops and captured a fortress in one of the most brilliantly executed assaults of World War II. The desert that should have killed them. The North African desert was a monstrous battlefield that respected no soldier, no rank, and no nation. It consumed men from the inside out. Days boiled flesh beneath uniforms, turning helmets into frying pans that radiated heat with every breath. The glare reflecting off dunes burned eyes, leaving soldiers squinting through constant headaches. Sandstorms swept across the land like biblical plagues, great rolling clouds that blotted out the sky, drowned patrols in suffocating grit, and reduced visibility to less than a meter. Sand seeped into water bottles, rations, rifle bolts, and even lungs. Coughing fits became as common as enemy fire. The nights were a cruel inversion black, star-filled, freezing to the marrow. In this desolate arena marched the 400 men of Australia's 26th Infantry Battalion, young men far from home, carrying rifles still warm from morning cleaning and marching under a sun already high and menacing. They had been hardened quickly, not by years of service or elite training, but by the unforgiving desert itself. Their boots sank into the soft sand with every step, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust, their canteens half empty long before midday. They had been ordered forward on reconnaissance, told to probe battalion positions and gather what information they could. No one at headquarters imagined they would encounter anything more than a handful of scattered enemy pickets or small rearguard detachments left behind after the retreat from Sidi Barrani. But the desert is a master of deceit, and the Australians marched unknowingly toward the defensive outer rim of a fortified Italian stronghold, an outpost garrisoned by 2,500 troops, stocked with artillery, machine gun nests, dug-in infantry, and officers under strict orders to hold the line. The Australians were about to walk blindly into impossible odds, with no artillery support, no tanks, no air cover, and no idea what waited beyond the next ridge of sand. The surprise encounter at Bardia. It happened almost by accident. As the Australians crested a series of low dunes, expecting another empty stretch of desert, their field glasses revealed shapes completely out of place, angular lines cutting across the natural curves of sand. At first, a few men thought it was a mirage, but as the heat shimmer calmed and the sun shifted, the truth materialized. Rows of sandbag machine gun pits, concrete bunkers sunk into the ground, patrols moving in and out of connected trench networks, and the unmistakable glint of artillery barrels aimed toward the open desert. The Australians froze. What they had uncovered was not a forward outpost, it was the outer defensive ring of a major Italian garrison, one that intelligence had not expected them to reach for another day or more. The Italians were not on alert. Their troops moved casually, unaware that 400 enemy soldiers were within striking distance. But the Australians were equally exposed. One spotted movement, one radio report from an Italian sentry, and the entire desert floor could erupt in a storm of machine gun fire and artillery shells. Retreat was possible, but retreat across flat desert in broad daylight would be suicide. Italian gunners would have a clear view of men withdrawing into empty terrain. The Australian officers huddled in the sand for a tense, whispered council, weighing their options. It was then they noticed something unusual. The Italians were not reacting. No flares, no order to man the guns, no coordinated shift in patrol routes. The garrison didn't see them as a threat. Perhaps the dust rising behind the Australians made them look like a much larger force. Perhaps Italian commanders assumed that any Allied troops appearing this close had to be part of a full brigade. Whatever the reason, the Australians suddenly understood the truth. The Italians didn't know they were only facing 400 men. And so, in a decision born of equal parts desperation and audacity, the Australians chose the unthinkable. They would not retreat. They would attack. Australians, attack the impossible. The order was passed down the line with a mixture of disbelief and electrifying adrenaline. Advance and engage. What followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The Australians burst forward with ferocity, Bren guns barking in long sweeping arcs that kicked enormous plumes of dust into the air, creating a rolling veil that concealed their true numbers. Riflemen yelled battle cries as they charged, firing from the hip, dropping, rolling, firing again, constantly moving to make it seem like dozens of men occupied every position. Mortar crews, sweating and cursing, began pumping out rounds at double the standard firing rate, lobbing bombs in wide patterns designed not to destroy the enemy but to create shock, confusion, and the illusion of heavy support. Italian observers, blinded by cascading dust clouds, misinterpreted every burst of noise as evidence of large infantry formations, supported by multiple heavy weapon detachments. The Australians had no such detachments. They were improvising everything noise, movement, and fire patterns to simulate the advance of a much larger brigade. Small assault teams stormed forward into trenches, using bayonets and grenades to clear dugouts rapidly before Italian units could react. Some Italians fired bravely, others hesitated, and still others abandoned their posts entirely when faced with such unexpected ferocity. Several positions were taken with barely a fight, not because the Italians lacked courage, but because they believed they were facing overwhelming numbers. The Australians leveraged every second of that misperception, pushing harder, faster, louder, until the battlefield itself seemed to shake under the pressure of their advance. What the Italians were witnessing did not match the reality on the ground, but the psychological effect was devastating. The psychological collapse of the Italian troops inside the Italian garrison, panic spread like wildfire. Men shouted over one another in the trenches, trying to make sense of the attack. Reports flooded into command posts claiming that hundreds of Australians had breached the southern line, that British tanks were moving behind the dunes, that artillery batteries were being overrun. None of it was accurate, but fear blurs the line between what is real and what is imagined. Italian officers attempted to restore order, but their men were hearing conflicting rumors from every direction. Some trenches believed they were flanked from the rear. Others thought paratroopers had landed behind them. Still others were certain that a motorized assault one that didn't exist was already underway. The Australians kept up the pressure, shouting commands intentionally loud enough to be overheard, increasing the rate of fire, and shifting positions constantly to mimic coordinated unit rotations. Italian soldiers who tried to stand and fire saw Australians advancing with terrifying speed and accuracy, moving as if backed by an army. Entire platoons fell back instinctively, abandoning perfectly defensible positions. Others simply surrendered, preferring captivity over what they believed was an encirclement by superior forces. Some Italians later confessed they thought they were fighting a division-sized assault, not 400 men. This psychological collapse didn't just unravel the Italian battle line, it tore it apart. And the Australians, exhausted and running low on ammunition, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The surrender of 2,500 Italian soldiers, the Italian commander, overwhelmed by conflicting reports and terrified of losing his entire garrison, finally made a decision. He ordered the complete surrender of his forces. To the Australians, it began with isolated pockets of soldiers rising from trenches with hands raised. But soon, it spread across the battlefield. Once the first few surrendered, morale collapsed entirely. White flags appeared atop dugouts and bunkers. Groups of Italian troops marched forward with rifles slung across their shoulders upside down, a universal symbol of yielding. In some sectors, Italians approached trembling, expecting harsh treatment. In others, they came forward almost gratefully, relieved to end the terror they believed surrounded them. When Australian officers began counting the prisoners, they were stunned, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Men kept pouring out of the garrison in steady streams. It took hours to assemble all the prisoners, and even longer to secure their weapons and supplies. The Australians, dusty, sunburnt, and drained, stared in disbelief at the sea of enemy soldiers they had subdued. They had been ready for annihilation, and instead found themselves escorting a captive force 6 times larger than their own battalion. Italian officers insisted they had been attacked by at least 2 full battalions supported by armor. They refused to believe the truth even when told directly. That disbelief was the clearest measure of what the Australians had achieved. The aftermath that shocked the British command. When news reached British headquarters, officers initially dismissed it as a clerical mistake. A small forward detachment capturing a few enemy patrols was believable, but the surrender of 2,500 Italians to just 400 Australians was statistically absurd. Yet reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the truth. The garrison was abandoned, with Italian troops marching under guard toward Allied internment camps. Senior British commanders arrived on site to inspect the battlefield themselves. What they found rewrote everything they believed about the North African campaign. Italian artillery positions were intact, ammunition stores untouched, machine gun nests fully supplied. The Italians had been materially capable of fighting for hours, possibly days. But they hadn't broken from physical assault. They had broken from perception, morale, and shock. The Australians had revealed a vulnerability in the Italian war effort that no intelligence report had ever captured. This event also provided priceless intelligence, maps, codes, supply logs, and operational orders that helped shape the next phase of Operation Compass. The Australians' confidence surged, and British commanders began to rely heavily on Australian infantry to lead aggressive advances. The victory became a legend passed from camp to camp, inspiring troops across the desert and redefining how the Allies approached engagements against Italian positions. The legacy of the 400, the story of the 400 Australians who shattered 2,500 Italian troops, became more than a battle account. It became a symbol of what boldness and psychological warfare could achieve. Historians still study the encounter as a rare moment where a vastly inferior force routed a superior one purely through aggression, deception, and timing. The Australians themselves downplayed the event, attributing their success to luck and the enemy's confusion. But every soldier who witnessed the surrender knew it had been something extraordinary. Their assault exposed a deeper truth about the Italian war effort. The soldiers were not inherently weak, but their leadership structure was brittle, their morale fragile when confronted with aggressive tactics, and their defensive doctrine overly reliant on assumptions of numerical superiority. The legacy of this battle resonated throughout the entire North African campaign, shaping strategy and solidifying the reputation of Australian troops as fierce, relentless fighters who could be trusted with the most hazardous missions. Even decades later, military academies analyze this event as one of the clearest demonstrations of how courage and psychology can overturn overwhelming odds. The Australians' victory was not just numerical, it was symbolic. A moment when a small battalion proved that determination and audacity could reshape an entire theater of war. The assault on Garrison became one of the most impressive small unit victories of the North African campaign. A reminder that in war, numbers alone don't decide battles, courage, training, and audacity do. And on that night in 1941, 400 Australians didn't just win a fight, they rewrote the rules of desert warfare. If you like, I can expand this into a longer documentary script, add chapter titles, add reenactment cues, or write a thumbnail, title combo.